So our session is titled Possibilities of Post-Colonial Decolonial Theories for Comparative International Education Research in, for, from Oceania. So as I was going through the abstract that I included in the special issue, I think there are three central tasks that we are trying to pursue in this session. The first one is to deconstruct the dominant knowledge of CIE. So that's what I'm going to do in my first presentation. I'll look at the foundational history of this field, comparative international education. In particular, I'm going to look at one of the most celebrated founding fathers of the field. His name is called Isaac Kandel, professor at the Columbia University. And the second task we're going to try to pursue is to open up space for new knowledges of new kinds of knowledges. Here we try to conceptualize others, peripherally others of the globe, as an intellectual resource. So Juliana's work, second presentation on the how Pacific leaders negotiate the international policy agenda to address the real issues on the ground, and Hickling-Hudson's work around the Grenada Revolution in the 1980s will address this agenda. And the third agenda we're trying to pursue is to document a resistance and a struggle for alternative to what we are often take for granted. Then Juliana's work again, and Anne's work, and then David's work on the resistance movement in this island, New Caledonia, will really try to do a historical documentation of the processes of resistance in education against French colonialism. So those are the three sets of challenge, and I understand that Christine is going to somehow pull all of this together in a nice, coherent way. Thanks, Christine.
2 minutes.
All right, so let's not waste any time. So my talk is called Colonial Legacies in Comparative International Education, Remembering Isaac Kandel. First of all, I think it's important to acknowledge that there is uneven global power relationship and production of CIE knowledge. This is from one of the leading fields in comparative education, G.P. Kelly in 1982 says the following: the field remains dominated by the English-speaking world and scholars in the United States, Britain, Canada, and Australia. The major journals in the field are in English, and as are most of the research studies. Moving on, in 2008, Heiho and Mundy, professors at the University of Toronto, Ontario Institute of Education Research, Education Studies, OEZ, published a textbook on the field, comparative international education. In that, they says the following: published histories of comparative education between the two world wars have tended to focus on prominent scholars in Europe, North America, and yet in this period, comparative education was being developed and taught in other parts of the world. As you may know, we have this thing called World Congress for Comparative Education Societies, and it's made up of 38 or 40 language-based and regional comparative education societies around the world. And in the same textbook, Heiho and Mundy speaks to the CIE, the field's involvement in colonial administration, where they state a dark side to comparative education. But this is the only reference you come across in any textbook that I have read so far, which actually indicates any involvement of the field with colonial legacy. But at least they acknowledge that there's some dark history of the field that we need to acknowledge, and I'm going to get to that. Moving on, most recent piece by Maria Manzo, based in Hong Kong. She says, a hierarchical structure in the field of knowledge production where some countries occupy a central paradigmatic position for other countries located at the periphery. So it seems to me over the last 30, 40 years, there has been a consistent critique of the uneven relationship in the production knowledge in the field. And it doesn't seem to be that it has changed much. Now, founding history. I don't know who actually specialized in comparative international education, who actually studied the history. But any textbook that you read will have the very, very remarkably similar historical narrative of the evolution of the field, right? So they always start with this guy called Marc Antony Julian. And then moving on to talk about familiar names from the global north, Michael Settler, Isaac Kendall, the person that I'm going to really focus on today, and Nicholas Hans Frederick Schneider, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. So I'm going to disrupt this comforting history. Robert Cohen, based in London, says something really interesting here. The histories of the field are comforting. They confirm a collective identity. They give us something to gossip about. And we can always ask our students, our colleagues, to read them when they ask tiresome questions such as, what is comparative education? Isaac Kendall. He was a professor at the Columbia University in New York, Teachers College. Started his career in the 1920s, and he finished off just after the war. And he is probably the most celebrated figure of the field. Epstein, for example, says, no one gave shape to early 20th century scholarship in comparative education more than Kendall. And in Kendall's book, published in 1933, called Comparative Education, according to Pollack, is the Bible in the field for many years to come. It sets the stage in Europe and North America for the field's scholarly development in the years and decades that followed. Kendall, Kazamias would argue, his legacy has been forgotten. We really have to read his legacy, his scholarship, in order to understand where we have come from. Good. Now, indeed, he has been celebrated as the champion of liberal humanism, a national difference, recognition of national difference, and internationalism. He was quite instrumental in the establishment of UNESCO. One of the most characteristic point that he consistently made in his career is this: in order to understand and appreciate and evaluate the real meaning of the education system of a nation, it is essential to know something of its history and traditions, of the forces and attitudes governing its social organization, of the political economic conditions that determine its development. This is so-called historical functionalism, which was quite dominant in the field when he was quite active. So he has been recognized as the field's great giant who saw each nation as one which uniquely forged its own way, as opposed to viewing one nation's education system as superior to another. So he takes, according to these critics, a culturally neutral, relativistic position, so that he doesn't say America is great. So just to go back to his career, so he did PhD at TC in 1910. TC's International Institute, funded by a Rockefeller Foundation. And Paul Morrow, his colleague, and Isaac Kendall were the key chief researchers at this institute. And they both started editing this journal, scholarly outlet called Educational Yearbook, which ran from 1924 to 1944, about 20 years. And they have done many, many commission evaluation reports on education systems in Puerto Rico and the Philippines, two new possessions of the imperial state of the United States at the turn of the century. And in Kendall's book, published in 1924, 25 Years of American Education, it's got two chapters. One is about the Philippines and Puerto Rico. So this is the context where he lived. He worked as a scholar. Uncle Sam's teaching who? So the kids in the front row, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, and the Philippines. And in the back of the classroom, you see what? Native American kids, but his textbook is upside down. And then outside the door, who is this? That was the context. Now, if you look at the picture on the left depicts United States as a benevolent ruler saving Cuba and Puerto Rico and other new possessions from the old cruel colonial rule of Spanish. So that was right after the Spanish-United States War in 1890, can't remember the name, at the end of the last century. So another picture just to show the geopolitical context of the time. So United States stepping on Philippines as a segue into attractive market in China and beyond. So Education Yearbook, for which he served as an editor, chief editor. He put together a special issue called Education in Colonial Dependencies. And here's Candle's introduction. The civilized world is gradually extending its boundaries, and the significance of educating vast millions of people who have hitherto been isolated and content with their own customs and traditions and occupations is being realized. The difference in cultural levels explain the failure of introducing American education system, which Candle regarded as the most advanced experiment in democratic education, into the Philippines and Puerto Rico. So he was really against the imposition of American systems in new possessions because the level of civilization is radically different, so that the most advanced democratic experiment of the United States is not going to work in those places. Because of the considerable civilizational gap, Candle cautioned readers about what he called policy of assimilation, an attempt to transplant modern education system to the natives, living hitherto under primitive conditions. Modern education introduced to the backward peoples of the Near East and in colonial dependencies must be adapted to their cultures and folkways and needs so that their rich body of culture will be reshaped to meet modern conditions. So 2 chapters on education in U.S. colonial possession in the book that I mentioned earlier, the 1924 book, absolutely legitimize the logic of benevolent U.S. imperial mission. For example, in the chapter on Philippines, it says the native languages are numerous and diverse, and there is no literature worthwhile in any shape and form in the Philippines. So underpinning Candle's work in the 1920s is the U.S. imperialistic logic. That is, the benevolent U.S. rule replaced negligent Spanish rule to provide free universal modern education to assist the uncivilized natives to move up the evolutionary scale. So this really forces us to question the Candle's respect for national difference, because it actually complements the imperial logic of civilizational gap. So his recognition of national character is actually sits comfortably with this US imperialist logic of planetary will to civilize the world. 2 minutes, thank you very much. Okay. So Kazamias, one of the leading historians of the field, have consistently argued that we need to remember Candle's legacy, particularly his belief in liberal humanism, internationalism, respect for national cultural differences, and so forth. But I would argue the legacy that we need to remember is a different kind of legacy. It's the legacy of deep colonial entanglement that Candle himself was deeply involved. Thanks very much.
I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which QUT, Queensland University of Technology in Brisbane, Australia, now stands, the place where I now work and live. I would like to also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which the University of New-Caledonia and Noumea now stand. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and recognize that these have always been places of teaching and learning. Oops. How do I go? My presentation this afternoon, I've got a paper here, but I'm not reading. I'm just talking to the PowerPoint, so I'll stick to the time. The notion of partners for development has always bothered me. When members of this society decided to change their name, the professional name of the society, from the Australian and New Zealand Comparative and International Education Society to Oceania Comparative and International Education Society. A lot of us can still remember the times when these conversations were beginning and the tensions around, well, what do we call ourselves? What is going to be the vision for this society? And what are the practicalities that's going to benefit both educators and children of the Pacific, as well as our own work as scholars in comparative and international education? So these conversations have kind of preoccupied my mind in the last 3 years. So for the sake of this presentation, I would like to very briefly look at the post-colonial framing of what it looks like to have comparative and international education in Oceania. Illustrate this from a post-colonial perspective by telling stories of 3 island educational experiences or recent initiatives in Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, and a Fiji-based regional project. And at the same time, I would like to draw some implications by inviting us to see how we can shift our ways of thinking about how we do our work as comparative education scholars, and at the same time, whether our engagement with Oceania itself is going to shift the way we do our work as scholars. So rethinking the usefulness of comparative and international education. The minute we start thinking about that particular concept, notions of education for national development, or development education, education for all, the Millennium Development Goals that were mentioned this morning by our keynote address. Education for sustainable development, education for sustainability. What does it mean? For me, as a Papua New Guinean working in Brisbane, the times when I see these flyers, posters of this sort of global agendas are times when I go to Papua New Guinea, and they're just everywhere. Everyone is talking about it. There is an influx of experts, donor agencies, government organizations, all doing things about these international or global agendas. I don't even see any of those flyers or posters at any classroom in Australia. It always bothers me how these agendas are often constructed, developed, initiated for those so-called underdeveloped or less developed countries, or whatever ways they want to classify it. We look at global imperatives as they are imagined and how they are delivered into the post-colonial context. And I'm talking about mainly countries that have been formerly colonized. A lot of these questions involve the involvement of foreign donors, governments and NGOs in the form of partners through the expertise of hired consultants and volunteers as development partners. A lot of our scholars within the society have researched, spoken, written about these practices as far as I can remember. So how does comparative and international education compare to these partners for development? What is the role of comparative and international education in these conversations? How does comparative and international education define its role as a partner for developing sustainable education in Oceania? You would see some of these are quite familiar in terms of aid to education in the Pacific. And for as long as we want to remember, they come and they go. It depends on how long they want to last. And in the end, we are there. What are we doing? We are neither partners nor experts. Spelled that way, we are no expatriates. So a post-colonial framing, thank you, Eve. I'm not going to try and define this any further than what Keita has done. And I know the people on the panel will be talking specifically about it. The only thing that I'd like to raise from these points on my PowerPoint slide is the fact that we think about post-colonial theory as a way of framing our intellectual energy to combat injustice in the form of neocolonialism, and I would like to add internal colonialism and hegemony within nation states. So we can talk about donor agencies. I'm from Papua New Guinea, I see it all the time. What does it mean to think about how colonial ideologies are kind of internalized and influence the current state of affairs within nation states? The other point I'd like to make is this thing on globalization. And the thing about it is, in the recent years, globalization was kind of a catchy thing, a fashionable, a sexy idea, that it gave a lot of opportunities for people to move around the world, and it did, except that there are tensions within that global marketplace. And this thing called ethnicity seems to be crying very loud every time. We think about diaspora communities and the fact that regardless of how good we are, the goalpost keeps shifting. For OCIS, developing culturally sustainable education for communities in Oceania does not only matter for communities on the islands in the Pacific, but domestically in both Australia and New Zealand. I would like to share the 3 stories that I have been fortunate enough to come to know over the recent times. The first one was on vernacular education in early childhood in Papua New Guinea. This was the time when they had the education for all movement. PNG education went kind of intoxicated with this agenda. And so it expanded the national education system, brought every child that could go to school into classrooms, and they decided they would start formal education at the age of 6 through elementary schooling. The policy also indicated they would learn in their native vernacular. So the years that followed, teachers were trained very quickly. They were sent to these schools, and hopefully they could engage in formal learning that kind of moved students from their native language, native systems, native ways of doing things into the formal education system that started in year 3. However, 10 years later, they began to realize that the standard of education was dropping, and everybody began jumping up and down that it was because they were learning to learn in their native mother tongue. So therefore, they were failing English. So the Minister of Education came out and said, well, let's do away with this policy. From now on, every child that goes to school learns in English only. Issues here are the mismatch of educational reform between national policies and priorities and ownership of educational change. The maintenance of vernacular as an artifact of knowledge systems and ways of knowing. So the issues of translation of global agendas into post-colonial settings, the notions of dependency on foreign financing and educational innovations, and the uncritical transfer of global models and the cultural politics that occur within PNG itself. My question is, how do we decolonize the system of education and our ways of thinking through the language of the colonizer? The second story that I was privileged to be part of the conversation was the story of the Economically Empowering Women's Project in the Solomon Islands. For those of you who don't know Vaca Pacifici, I think the next conference is in Fiji next year. Go ahead, you might enjoy the conference thoroughly. It was led by a group of Solomon Island women, a project that was locally initiated to support rural women with family responsibilities, children's welfare, community leadership, and balancing cultural expectations with sustainable living. Financial literacy emerged as the key issue, leading to learning the language of banking and financial management. Paula argues that this experience reminds us of what the purpose of education should be, to inculcate knowledge, skills, and values for sustainable living, whether urban or rural. And I must add, the theme for that conference, the Vaca Pacifici, was Education for What? Revisited, meaning that question has been around for quite a while. The thing that I took away from that presentation was the indigenous wisdom and the kinship values underlying the self-sacrifice and ability of the Solomon Island women to facilitate that sort of project. The final one was the Rethinking Pacific Education Initiative. And I think the leaders of that project are present at this conference. Dr. Anna, Professor Konai, Professor Kabini, and your team. If you have any questions about this, see them. What I want to just quickly mention is what do this mean for CIE in these very difficult circumstances for both islanders and scholars of comparative and international education. The only thing I'd like to mention right now is that we need to decontextualize, deconstruct our research. That sometimes conceptualizing our research on the islands, on the education, on international agendas, within the center often blinds us to the complexities that happens on the islands itself. Thank you.
My name is Anne Hickling-Hudson. I'm here as probably one of only 2 Caribbean people in this room, myself and my colleague from Belize, who is also in the audience. It's wonderful to be here, and I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and ancestors of all our lands with the common experience of having been so brutally exploited by European colonialism. My focus today is going to be on my educational experience and my experience as both an educator and a learner in the Grenada Revolution. Some of you may not have heard of this, but for me, it has remained a watershed in my own personal and educational development. I have reached the stage of being an elder, retired, still linked to a university in Australia. And I've worked in many contexts in education globally. I've studied and worked in the UK, in Hong Kong, in Jamaica, Grenada, Australia, and the USA. And when I think of my experience in Grenada, a tiny little island, bit like Numia, same sort of population, I think your population is about just over 100,000. This is a unique experience that I've had. Let's put the revolution in the context of the Caribbean. If you look at this part of the map, you'll see these small islands dominated by the British, as well as Jamaica, for over 300 years, and as I said, brutally exploited and shaped for their own interests. I just want to go back to this first side, because it was in the 1970s that this revolution, political revolution in Grenada, started to transform the society's extreme poverty, malnutrition, illiteracy, backwardness, superstition, dependence, domination, and division, in the words of the beloved leader of the revolution, Maurice Bishop. The achievements of the revolution were incredible. It only lasted 4.5 years, but it started to turn around the history of brutal colonial oppression. Several thousand new jobs were created. Unemployment went down from almost 50% to 14% in 4 years. There were immense improvements in the social sectors, health, education, and so on. New organizations started, women, youth, farmers, trade unionists. The idea of national development became popular. Political mobilization was engendered, and cultural initiatives flowered. However, there were huge contradictions, and I want to reflect on these today. A joyful revolutionary movement successfully tackled some of colonialism's worst legacies. But this was contradicted by shattering tragedy when conflict within the Revolutionary Party, the New Jewel movement, resulted in fratricidal killings on both sides of the conflict. Army personnel and the revolution's leader, Maurice Bishop, together with 7 of his colleagues, were all shot and killed. So the question that the region and the world is faced with is, why did this happen? How could such a beautiful process end like this? And what is left behind? And I'm arguing that to analyze this, we need a post-colonial and decolonial approach. I conflate the two. I don't see a division between them. Utilizing methods of history, politics, political economy, cultural studies, memory, and moral philosophy. So the goals of this presentation is to reflect on my watershed learnings as an educator in the Grenada Revolution, which helps me to understand what was so culturally significant and unique about it, and to reflect on how post-colonial theory can be used to enrich our understanding of such processes. These 2 books, recently produced in 2014, have been excellent in helping us to use this theory and work it in new directions to understand the revolution. So I'll start with the education achievements when I'm thinking about all the things that were done in this sector. New schools were built, 2,000 new high school places of the 9,000 needed, student councils, a modernized curriculum and exam system, student subsidies for uniforms and food. So I think just briefly some of the things that have stayed with me. I was involved in a workshop run by Paulo Freire for 50 teachers at the beginning of the revolution, which exposed me to Freire's method of dialogic education, something that utterly changed my understanding of how learners could make knowledge. The next thing was the teacher education program, NISTEP, National In-Service Teacher Education Program, a massive problem-solving structure. Hundreds of teachers had been left by the British without any qualifications at all. 2/3 had no qualifications. And somehow the revolutionary government worked out a way of putting them all into an in-service teacher education structure in which I was involved. That was a massive learning experience as to how you could solve a problem like this with, with the vision that they had. A new type of curriculum through work study. These things, each of them I could, write a book chapter on, but we just have to race through. Worker education in NISTEP. Now, this is something maybe worth talking about because they had a process of worker education in which we studied political developments in all organizations. So when I went to my first meeting of that worker education program, I thought it was going to be the academic staff, but it was everybody, the grounds people, the sweepers, everybody. I had never experienced such a thing in my entire life, to get together with people of different hierarchies in, colonial society. And that was the kind of thing that they did. Another important thing, a complete and radical structure for adult literacy and continuing education. I actually did part of my PhD thesis on this. I can't go into it, but it was a mind-blowing experience. Community solidarity. In our neighborhood, we work together on road building because the government can't do everything. It's poor. So neighbors get together and help build roads, clean sidewalks, ditches, drains, and so on. Something unprecedented in my entire experience. Then the public meetings in which politicians came and were questioned by the people. So you had parish councils, zonal councils, a meeting in which we questioned the budget and that kind of thing. My other deep learnings in the 2 years that I spent in Grenada was the interaction with Cuban education, a model of education completely outside the norm of British education or anything that I had ever experienced. So that was another watershed area of learning in which I understood what equity could look like. Another thing was the process of education planning in which I was involved, something that I hadn't seen happen in Jamaica or the other islands. So I felt that all these things were enough to warrant a PhD study of the incredible achievements in education in the revolution. Just quickly, pictures to give you a look at Grenada. So on the left is Bernard Cord, the economic genius of the revolution, as they called him, the mover and shaker of economic and political transformation, and Maurice Bishop, beloved and popular leader. And the budget preparation process, each year, the politicians met with the people to plan the budget. More pictures of the budget workshops and meetings. Another thing was the unchaining of the popular Creole language in the revolution. And Chris Searle, a British scholar, wrote a lovely book after the collapse of the revolution called Words Unchained, Language and Revolution. This wonderful scholar, Merle Collins, expressed herself in Grenadian Creole for poetry writing. Then another important thing was the National Women's Organization, in which women got together to, demand their rights. The Cubans assisted Grenada very much in helping them to build an airport. Before that, they only had a little field where a tiny little plane could come and land, but now the Cubans helped them to build a modern international airport. Just to give you a look at some of the streets, the market, agriculture was being transformed, new agricultural enterprises set up, the harbor trading, inter-island trading was improving because of the improvement in agriculture. And then the horror of the fratricidal killings of 14 in Grenada, which paved the way for the US invasion on the 25th of October, 1983. They sent 10,000 troops into this little country, 12 miles by 20, of 100,000 people. They bombed buildings, including a hospital, and killed and imprisoned members of the revolutionary government. But of course, so many people were traumatized by the killings of the leaders, the way they killed each other, that they welcomed the US invasion. And the US, of course, lost no time in demonizing and dividing the revolutionary government, accusing one side of being more socialist than the other. And therefore, they were the criminals, and the country had to be rescued by the heroic USA. Okay, this book that I showed you, Omens of Adversity by David Scott, is post-colonial in genre. It takes as its context and case material political economy, history, the politics of revolution and its collapse, and the aftermath of the US invasion. And he points out that Cuba, Grenada, Nicaragua occurred at a time when revolutionary futures were possible. They took a euphoric leap into the future. It was also the beginning of the end of revolutionary socialist possibility, the era of Thatcher and Reagan, when those possibilities were going down. So it seemed to seal the end of revolutionary solutions. As a historian, he takes unsettling arguments which makes you rethink the entire US story of what happened in the revolution. We don't have time, as I said, it would take a long time to go into it. Another wonderful book takes more of a cultural studies approach, which I think is essential to add to the political economy approach of that David Scott takes. This is by a Caribbean woman, Shalini Puri, and I have been inspired by the way that she organizes her study, looking at unusual things like the landscape. What did it mean, how it changed? Interviews of all sides of the story, not just one or the other. Music and literature, photos, museums, things, memorabilia that people kept, and architecture. And she weaves this into a gripping and passionate narrative, showing the importance of memory and how memory was silenced in the Grenada story. So once you read her book, you completely destabilize categories like comrade or traitor or vanguard or collaborator, and you focus on what it would mean to imagine alternative politics. Okay, sorry, I don't have time for this, but this is how she uses calypso to show how people responded to the revolution. So some of the changes in education were sustained, for example, improved post-school opportunities. And 2 decades after the collapse, a government turned again to Cuba for help, and the Cubans today help Grenada with education, scholarships, and adult literacy. But on the whole, the model of education is the same as it is in the rest of the Caribbean. That is neocolonial. So the enduring question is, how do we move out of the stratified, imitative, neocolonial model of education in which only a minority receives an excellent education? My conclusion is that the education model that we practice in our countries illustrates the dilemmas and contradictions that Keita pointed out in his introduction, the modernity-coloniality interconnection, because colonialism is the other side of modernity. Our education systems may be modern, but they're also neocolonial. That is, they're still undemocratic, unequal, exploiting the poor, unjust, culturally weak, and unsuitable for development. However, systems have cracks and tensions within them. Education in the Grenada Revolution showed alternative possibilities that I don't think would have been possible without a revolutionary context. So my last question is, in the context of continuing imperialist power and a certain form of neoliberal globalization, how will we reshape education to overcome its neocolonial flaws and grasp its revolutionary possibilities? Thank you.
Avant de prendre la parole, je voudrais d'abord dire un mot pour reconnaître le peuple kanak, peuple indigène, peuple légitime de ce pays. Je veux aussi dire un mot pour reconnaître tous les gens kanak qui ont donné leur vie pour la lutte, pour la libération du peuple kanak. Surtout le 19 d'ouvert qui a été tué le 5 novembre 1988. Je fais le reste de mon discours en anglais, j'essaie de parler lentement et en même temps d'arriver à la fin. Alors voilà mon objectif, d'arriver à la fin et de parler assez lentement pour que vous puissiez me comprendre. I've written a little backgrounder that's in the conference pack you might have had a chance to look at. I've also got a full paper here, 23-page paper on the same kind of topic, and since it's that long, I have no intention of trying to cram all of that stuff into my 15 minutes. So I'll make some general comments that will 17, okay, that will overlap. I can be contacted through multiple forums, email, Facebook, Snapchat, WeChat. You find me everywhere except Instagram. I haven't quite got my head around that one yet. So I just thought I'd start with this little image. You might not have seen it, the visitors to this country, but this is a shot I took from the front of the bus as we were arriving the other day. And behind the fancy yachts over there in the background is a place called Coxon. And Coxon is the prison, New Caledonia's prison. And if you were wondering why there's not quite so many Kanak faces you find at university, you want to go somewhere where you find lots of Kanak people, that's the place to go. 90% Kanak inmates and a population of under 40% of the population. And it's interesting that here we are in Nouvelle, in the same little place right next door. We've got the prison and we've got the university. We've got these two social institutions, the social institution of reward and the social institution of punishment. And you look at where the Kanak people are and you look at where the Kanak people aren't. And every society has these institutions. They're powerful institutions, and part of their power is that they appear to operate according to rational, objective, reasonable criteria, neutrally distributing society's rewards and punishments along agreed criteria. but actually you look at the power, you look at the effect of them, and you look at them in a colonial context like New Caledonia, and you see that these are both institutions created by colonialism that are having a very powerful effect at reinforcing colonial relations historically and still today. And the system of rewards and the systems of punishments and the institutions that distribute these are definitely closely related. One stark illustration of this, just in relation to New Caledonia, is that it was only last year that the first Kanak was admitted to the bar to practice law as a lawyer. And that, I understand from a lunchtime conversation, was at the University of Auckland. And this is after colonisation started in 1853. And that is an indication, even though, you got more than 90% of that prison population are Kanak. That's an illustration of the educational shutout of Kanak people in this country, which is quite extraordinary, quite extraordinary. People will have you've heard people referring in their presentations to the baccalaureate. Baccalaureate that's decided in France is the pinnacle of the French school system. It's the key, the bac général is the key to all higher education. The first Kanak to get the baccalaureate, the right to proceed to higher education, was 1962. That's how recent it was. That's an indication of the extent to the shutout of Kanak people from the colonial education system here. It's a little bit hard to know exactly the extent of that shutout right now. The last time educational statistics were available by ethnic breakdown was in 1993. And after that point, for reasons related to French law and educational policy and constitutional niceties and so on, there are no ethnic breakdowns available. But there was a huge gap. There was a huge, very, very stark evidence of Kanak educational underachievement, particularly at those higher levels of school, and there's been no indication since then that that gap has closed significantly, certainly not at those higher levels of baccalaureate. There are some lower state, the bac professionnel, where you see more Kanak people, but the shutout at those higher levels is still very, very strong. I just thought that might be useful in terms of just a brief historical overview to show you this picture, and thanks to Amandine for finding the image for me. It was in her geography textbook that she used in her thing. I've seen this before, but I thought this would be an interesting illustration, because those little black dots on the Grande Terre are the Kanak reserves. And those Kanak reserves are the areas that were set aside for Kanak people from the late 19th century. And it's not just that they were set aside for Kanak people. Kanak people were forcibly dispossessed of effectively all of their land. This isn't the leftovers. These are little bits, isolated, infertile areas that they were herded onto and dumped without any concern about customary links, languages, alliances between clans, hostilities between clans, just dumped in these tiny, tiny reservations. And it wasn't just that these were places they could sort of stay and travel around. They were confined to these reservations until after the Second World War, not allowed to leave without express permission from the French authorities. So those tiny little dots there are an indication of the level of exploitation and brutality and humiliation that Kanak people suffered for such a long time and until relatively recently. And the other image I want to show you is this one, which is probably sort of the pinnacle of that humiliation and degradation. That's a poster from the Exposition coloniale in Paris in 1931. And one of the exhibits at that Exposition coloniale was a group of Kanak men who were brought over there under false pretenses from different parts of the country, not speaking the same language, who were exhibited as a part of the flora and fauna of France's colonial empire, with the title on the cage, Cannibals from New Caledonia. So this process of exploitation and degradation and humiliation, education was an absolutely central aspect to this, an absolutely central aspect. And I was struck by a comment that Hetty made in the seminar yesterday, talking about that amazing literacy program that's been done in the Solomon Islands and Cook Islands and Tonga. And one of the things she said about what they were trying to do, and it wasn't part of the presentation, it was just something she said, and it just stuck in my mind. She said, what we try to do with these children is we're giving value to what they bring from home. We're saying, what have they got? What's their experience? What's their knowledge? And building a literacy program around giving value to what they bring from home. And what struck me is that is like the exact opposite. That is the exact opposite of colonial education. Because what colonial education does is that it tells people what colonial education did here was it told Kanak people that nothing they bring from home is of any value at all. Absolutely no value. Nothing they bring from home is of any value for them as Kanak people. Because education, colonial education, was about liberating them from any notion that their knowledge and their beliefs were worthwhile. That was what education was about. It was about making sure that they understood that anything they brought from home was worthless, and anything that was worth knowing, they get from the colonial school. And there was certainly nothing of value that they might bring from home that would be of value to European society. And so it's really interesting hearing some presentations talking about learning from Kanak relations with the land and education for sustainable development and putting some value on that, because it really is, until quite recently, the exact opposite of what was going on in education. The origins of the Kanak independence movement go back to 1969. That's 52 years after the suppression of the last Kanak revolt in 1917. That's 52 years where Kanak people realised that fighting back was just going to make things worse, and they just needed to survive and do as best they could as subject colonised people trying to survive in this context. And the start of it was a group of progressive New Caledonian students in France, some Kanak, some Caldoche as well, who produced a little journal called Le Kanak Homme Libre. And in that journal, that first journal, Nidoish Neslin, who was the son of the High Chief from Marais, wrote an article, Aspect Noir du Problème Blanc. And there was some earlier stuff written by Pasteur Apollinaire that's a little bit hard to find, but this is, in terms of the modern independence movement, the kind of the earliest work. And it's a really interesting article where he is analysing the ways that French colonialism was alienating Kanak people from themselves. And in that very first article, education was a major target of his critique. The initial focus of that group was the starting point was convincing Kanak people that they weren't worthless, that they did have things worthwhile, that they were worthwhile people. And this was when the word Kanak started. Kanak was a really, really pejorative term. They were Melanesian. Everybody called them Melanesian, but everybody, when they were referring to them, called them Sal Kanak. It was a really, really put down term, and Nestlin was the first from this group to start calling themselves Kanak and wearing things with Kanak on it and calling themselves Kanak. So that was a massive political statement. And as that movement grew, the French colonial education system became a prime target of the independence movement. Through the 70s and the 80s, the growing Kanak independence movement became increasingly impatient with the slowness of the French government, who were not really taking their political demands seriously. And that impatience, that political impatience, was paralleled with an educational impatience as well. The education system was not meeting the needs of Kanak society. It was not giving. It was only a very few people were able to access the higher levels of education in France. And after several smaller boycott campaigns, the main group in the Kanak independence movement, the FLNKS, eventually decided to make a permanent a permanent boycott and create their own education system called the École Populaire Kanak, the EPK. There's a whole lot we could say about the EPK, but let me just say this: that the EPK was subject to all sorts of obstacles and challenges and problems, which we could talk about and has been written about elsewhere. But one of the consequences of it was that it meant that all of the Kanak educational activists, the independentists who were active in education, got out of the system, were out of the education system, and creating this independent, separate system for a future independent state. And that was actually part of the critique of Ali Poigoun, who was a important leader of the independence movement, but was a radical, but was a critic of the EPK, because he said, actually, you guys are doing all this work, but the colonial system isn't that upset to see you leaving because you're not in there, hassling them the way you used to be. And the long-term consequence of this is quite interesting. The post-conflict period, I call it, began with the Matignon Accords in 1988 and was kind of cemented with the Noumea Accord in 98, and that brought an end to this policy of rupture and replaced it with a strategy of development. Professor Dale drew our attention to the whole, the wide variation with what means when we use the word globalization. But as we all know, if there's any word, there's possibly more interpretations of than globalization is development. And development is not a technical process. It's not just an economic concept. It's not what is done to people or done for people. For real development, for effective, sustainable development, it must be defined by the people. The people must be defining the scope, the scale, the pace, the priorities of development, everything about it. This control of the form of development is what kind of gives its effect to what Freire referred to as our ontological vocation of human beings, of making our societies better places, of critiquing what we've got and trying to make it better. The concern of many Kanak activists was that the kind of development envisaged by the Matignon Accords would not bring about the independence of the country or the liberation of the Kanak people, but would just lock them into systems of dependence and in the lower levels of society. The Matignon Accords, after the agreement was made in Matignon and the two sides came back here, the anti-independence group took about an hour and a half to ratify the Accords. The independence movement took 2 whole weekends worth of Congress. There were huge divisions. And interestingly, those who were working most closely on education, and particularly those in the EPK, were among those who were the most critical of and the most sceptical of the Matignon Accords. And so when the process began, they they were marginalised from the independence movement. They were not engaged in it. And you had a situation where the educational authorities of East Waikato were still producing documents that were claiming that the education system as it existed was basically doing pretty well and not that much change was required. It's now almost 30 years since the Accords were signed. And it's interesting to hear of, what I'd call some positive new developments of attempts to seek a rapprochement between, that's actually a French word that's bad, that's one of a good one in English that we've kind of made our own, better than anything we got in English, between educational researchers, practitioners, and some of the key people from the EPK. It's encouraging to see that. But I think some key questions still remain, and I've got that little question mark there in terms of what this whole thing of independence is. That it was Blount who made the comment that colonial regimes, where they do finally grant independence, they always want it to be given in such a way that it's not seen as the fruit of struggle, but rather as a graduation, rather as the colonial government deeming that the colonised people are now of sufficient level of development and understanding and civilisation that they're capable of governing themselves. And there's overtones of that throughout the kind of development process that's being set in train here. But I just want to leave with these three questions. How do you move from an oppressive and repressive colonial regime from one moment to become a partner in development the next? How does that process take place? How do you define the content and the process of development from that context, engaging all those people, the people who are the representatives, but also the people who are directly affected? And finally, and in particular from this context, how do you ensure that education in New Caledonia can undergo the sort of thorough transformation that is required if it is to genuinely meet the needs of Kanak people? Thank you. Oleti.
Can you hear me here? Is this working? No? Yes? Good? Okay. Do you want me to? Oh, I thought, so I'll expand from the two that I planned. Okay. I want to just start with two general observations based on what we've heard, and then just a couple of specific things from each of the speakers. I'm very conscious of the fact that this session is called Possibilities of Post-Colonial, Decolonial Theories for Comparative and International Education Research in, for, and from Oceania. So I'm conscious that I'm speaking in those terms. So the first observation, I think, is that that was come up from this, the crucial importance of context of place, context of culture, context of language, context of history, context of personal experiences and personal fulfillment, context of power, inequality, oppression, and racism. The second point I wanted to make was about the connections and interconnections between comparative international education and concepts and theories of post-coloniality and concepts of development and development aid for sustainable development goals. In contrast, we also have concepts of insincerity and deception regarding the motivation of some powerful members of elites in the world and powerful donors, often not helping us in our development aims for human rights, not done for ethical or moral reasons, not done for sustainable development. But often, as I quote Suzanne Mahanovich, who's an eminent Canadian comparativist who's just published something in World Studies in Education, and she says, but often to increase global security of the powerful elites rather than sustainable development. And I would recommend that you read her paper when it comes out. And I'm also very, very conscious of what Roger said this morning about our comparative ideas, sometimes morally ranked according to the capacity to fit with global marketization. So keeping those in mind. First to Keita. Major rethinking of dominant knowledge construction of the field. Yes, not just knowledge construction, but the construction of consciousness and a way of thinking in terms of post-coloniality. I was very conscious that you brought up some of the history of comparative education, which many of them were comparativists and not comparative and international educationists. And thinking back to Kandel, whose book was published in 1924, and to put his book into perspective, in 1931, we have a picture of people, Kanaks going to the Paris, the Paris conference, picturing people as savages and cannibals. And so he was writing in an era where colonialism was still very normal. And I think a lot has changed in relation to comparative and international education and in relation to the World Council of Comparative and Education Societies, of which many of us are members. You may not know that Anne Hickling-Hudson was the president of the World Council from 2001 to 2004, and she was the person who organised a conference in Cuba for one of our congresses. And for the privilege of us going to Cuba, there were quite a lot of people, white Europeans, who opposed the idea, and it was a very, very difficult time for her. Eve is now on the executive of the World Council, and for 7 years I was the Secretary General of the World Council. So we feel very strongly about the possibilities and perspectives of comparative and international education, and it's changed a lot, I think, over the last 90 years. But it's really interesting to see it as originally pretty much an imperialist exercise and trying to compare systems that were not comparable. So that's really nice to put it all into historical perspective. And Julie, talking about advancing the field, I think that's a very important issue for us in the Pacific, in Oceania, including Australia and New Zealand, but not exclusively Australia and New Zealand. And talking about dialogue and how OCIES can shift our thinking about dialogue between countries. As long as the dialogue is authentic and as long as people are not trying to push their own agenda in spite of the people that they are pretending to help, as long as it's to do with human rights and environmental rights and the rights of us to develop sustainably. And Anne, where's Anne gone? Oh, there you are. Anne, as usual, clarity of her post-colonial lens and the power of that and the power of personal experience, which brings me again to the power of context and not trying to make everything as if it's normal in this country and therefore normal in another country and therefore that's the way we should go. And so I do think personal experiences and single case studies, contrary to Kazimaias and a few other comparativists, I think a case study in comparative education is really, really useful. You don't always have to compare one country with another or one system with another. You can develop a context and then other people can have a dialogue about it, which becomes a comparative conversation. David was, as usual, very powerfully presenting a point of view which I think we all are very, very close to about how we can transform and how history can tell us a lot about the best way forward. So it was an extraordinary story. I learned a lot from your paper. I did find the paper and read it. It was good, but not the 21 pages. So just in conclusion, because I just wanted a few minutes to talk about this, is that I think the importance of us here today in Noumea talking about different aspects, different contexts, is a wonderful way to be able to exchange our ideas. And I feel that the Society of OCIES is alive and really working very well, and it is a wonderful venue for us in which to compare our experiences. And as Eve is probably going to just say, we do have an AGM very soon, and it would be great if lots of people came, and it would be wonderful if many of you became members.
Thanks, Chris. That's great. It is afternoon tea time. We are starting the AGM 3:30 on the dot. 2 questions maybe? No, well, can we have a question directed to each of our speakers? Anyone, question for Keita? Yes? Here comes the microphone.
I have a question for David Small. David, do you think the recent New Caledonia education project can finally lead to non-colonial education in New Caledonia?
Thanks for the question. I hope so. I hope so, but and there are positive things about it. I haven't read it very closely, but it talks about developing a New Caledonian project and a New Caledonian emphasis on the education system. It talks about recognising the status of Kanak people. It talks about supporting Kanak languages and so on. But I think that, as with anything, an education project is the success of an education project is tied to the success of a social project, and that is the big question. I think is the social project, and where is that going to go, and how is that going to be resolved, and what is that going to look like from 2019 onwards. And I don't know the answer to that. I don't know whether anybody knows the answer to that. But it reads well. That document, I felt reads quite well.
Thank you. Anybody else? Matthew?
Thanks so much to everyone on the panel. What an amazing collection of scholars, and just really feel privileged to be here. I guess my question is primarily for Keita, though perhaps others want to comment as well. In thinking historically, I think we've looked at, or you've laid out very clearly some of the dangers of comparison. And I'm wondering, in the contemporary setting, thinking about some of the dangers of comparison in moving forward. And I guess I'm framing that partly in respect to some of my colleagues who would not consider themselves comparativists or to be in comparative and international education in any form, and yet I see their work increasingly being transnational in scope and what I would consider comparison. And so it kind of begs this question, are we all comparativists now? And what is the potential danger of that? Thanks.
All right, thanks very much for the question. But before I answer the question, I want to get back to the point that Chris raised, the importance of placing the discussion of Kandal in a historical perspective. I want to argue with that idea. First of all, when we say colonialism was the norm of the time, whose perspective are we taking? Those people who were subject to the colonization, did they think that that was the norm of the time? The first response to that. And also, I guess the issue that I was raising with the way in which the legacy of Campbell has been discussed in the field is the fact that none of the people in the field talk about his engagement and entanglement with the colonial legacy. People continue to talk about him as the beacon of liberal humanism. To me, that's deeply, deeply troubling in terms of going back to the point that you raised, Chris, the identity as a field and consciousness of being what it means to be a comparative. I think we have to have thoroughgoing rethinking of the way in which we construct the field knowledge. And going back to Matthew's point, sorry, what was the question? I'm kidding, sorry. Are we all prepared? Well, I mean, that's a sort of a tiresome question that, that Robert Cohen sort of asked us to move away from. Wow, yeah, I understand. Everyone seems to be comparing educations nowadays. So how do we define ourselves? How do we distinguish ourselves from other education scholars who all seems to be comparing education? To me, I think, I critique Campbell's work, but I think there's something important in there too. So the founding history of the field is useful and important, while at the same time it's inadequate, right? So Campbell's notion of historical functionalism, this really importance on understanding the historical context of education and deep political dynamics within a nation state that really shape the nature of education system that arises from that context and so forth, right? I think that's an important legacy that we need to inherit from Campbell. Okay. And I think that really distinguishes us from rather superficial discussion of education in comparative terms that, most clearly represented by PISA and so forth. So just to be clear where I stand on Campbell, I think his legacy is really important. And I partly agree with Kazamias that we need to inherit the liberal humanist motif of his work, while at the same time, we really have to rethink the way in which he has been represented in the field.
Thank you, Keita. Has anyone a question for either Julie or Anne? Okay. I think the 4 papers were fantastic, and we will endeavour to get them published, and we hope to do that bilingually. They deserve to be out there. It's been a wonderful session, so I'm sorry about the late start and having to rush people through. Please accept my apology.